Good morning. Welcome to Bible class. May the 3rd, I think it is. Who keeps up with dates anymore? The 8 somethings, we'll have to come up with a name for ourselves maybe. Although Stephen did mess up our numbers last week by being under the weather. And it was the 7th. But we are finishing up today chapter 11, Acts chapter 11, and then we will start Acts chapter 12. In talking about these elders at the end of chapter 11, in the Greek, the definite article is used, and that would suggest that he's talking about a specific group of elders. And the most reasonable view of this is that these were the elders of the Jerusalem church. And this is the first time that elders is mentioned, are mentioned. And the qualification of these elders, also called bishops in Acts 20, verse 17, Acts 20, verse 28, or pastors, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, are found in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. And we're not going to go through those qualifications in this class, but that's where those qualifications are found. Since this contribution was ultimately for all needy brethren in Judea, it is likely that the Jerusalem elders supervised the distribution of this aid to other congregations in that region. And so therefore we see then a cooperative effort between these first century churches of Christ. And that is a very powerful argument for the fact that God intended that his people everywhere be united and that we have authority to work together. And modern denominationalism, however, would be an assault upon this principle because they are not united in the same beliefs and practices and other things that Christ Church would have. And there is another matter that needs just a little moment of thought at this point. Time and again, it is emphasized in the book of Acts that these first century Christians saw to the needs of one another. If the modern church, if today's church would conscientiously follow this principle, would any faithful child of God need to be in any way on any kind of help? Could we even do away with members of the church perhaps being on welfare and other things of that nature if the church practiced the things as the first century church did? There's nothing intrinsically wrong with a genuinely needy Christian receiving government assistance. Not saying that if necessity dictates, but such might say something about the church as well. And maybe it should give us some thought. Maybe it should give us pause to think about, are we doing all that we should be doing? And at the same time, I am fully aware that the church does not have a never-ending supply of funds itself. And there's a difference between helping those who are in need and someone just constantly thinking that the church ought to take care of everything in their life without them taking part. to try to help in that as well. But anyway, that could generate some conversation, I'm sure. But we're going to move on to chapter 12. Acts chapter 12. And I want to look at the first 19 verses, of chapter 12, and then we will talk about those verses. Now about that time, Herod the king put forth his hands to afflict certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. And those were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had taken him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him forth to the people. Peter, therefore, was kept in the prison, but prayer was made earnestly of the church unto God for him. And when Herod was about to bring him forth, the same night Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards before the door kept the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him. And a light shined in the cell, and he smote Peter on the side, and awoke him, saying, Rise up quickly. And his chains fell off from his hands. And the angel said unto him, Gird thyself, and bind on thy sandals. And he did so. And he saith unto him, Cast thy garments about thee, and follow me. And he went out and followed, and he knew not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. And when they were past the first and the second guard, they came unto the iron gate that leadeth into the city, which opened to them of its own accord. And they went out and passed on through one street, and straightway the angel departed from him. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, Now I know of a truth, that the Lord hath sent forth his angel, and delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gate, a maid came to answer, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for joy, but ran in and told that Peter stood before the gate. And they said unto her, Thou art mad. But she confidently affirmed that it was even so. And they said, It is his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened, they saw him and were amazed. But he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him forth out of the prison. And he said, Tell these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went to another place. Now, as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers, what was become of Peter. And when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and tarried there. Quite a story. Not just a story made up, the truth, a narrative. Within the same general time frame of Barnabas and Saul's benevolent mission to Judea, Herod the king sought to bring some affliction within the Jerusalem church. Now, this Herod, there are several Herods that we read about in the New Testament. This Herod is known as Agrippa the First. And he was the grandson of Herod the Great, the one who had slaughtered the infants in an attempt to eliminate Christ in Matthew chapter 2. He is the nephew of Herod Antipas, who decapitated John the Baptizer. And Agrippa had been granted the title king by the emperor Caligula, with territories in northeast Palestine. And in AD 41, he also had been placed over both Samaria and Judea by Claudius. Now, Agrippa murdered James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, with the sword. One of the early church writers, history writers, Eusebius, actually citing Clement of Alexandria, says that James was also beheaded. Only 2 crimes called for that punishment under the Jewish system. Communal apostasy or idolatry was one, and willful murder was the other, neither of which applied in this case. But what did Herod really care about legalities? According to the Mishnah, the victim was decapitated standing up so that his head would fall to the ground. And James was the first apostle to shed his blood for the Master's cause. An event, incidentally, which fulfilled the Savior's prophecy that he would drink the cup of suffering as Jesus did. You might remember John and James came to Jesus wanting leadership roles, Mark chapter 10, and in particular verse 39. And Jesus told him that he would partake of the suffering. And this is that time fulfilled for James. Whereas this reign of terror, if you want to call it that, under the hand of Saul had been suspended, had been stopped significantly when the Jewish zealot had been converted, Herod, in an effort to court favor with the Jews, now wants to take part in this and put his hands in with into the blood of the saints. McGarvey cites this sentence of only 7 words in the Greek text, as an example of the restraint of the sacred writer, and so as evidence of the inspiration of the New Testament record. I'm sure Luke had very deep feelings about the death of James as he wrote these things and heard about these things, but only uses 7 words in the Greek to tell about it. That's a lot of restraint. James' death pleased the Jews. And when Agrippa saw that, then he went on to also seize Peter as well. And the groveling disposition here, so graphically shown to us by Luke, is strikingly confirmed by the testimony of Josephus, the historian. He says that Agrippa was very ambitious to please the people in his book Antiquities. Luke informs the reader that it was the days of unleavened bread when he had Peter arrested. That is, it was the 7 days just before the Passover, during which the Jews ate only unleavened bread. And this reference is probably inserted to explain why there was a delay in dealing with Peter. And likely Herod, who conveyed the impression that he, very meticulously and scrupulously followed the Jewish law and obeyed the Jewish customs, wanted to wait until the feast week was over before he did anything with Peter. And so, therefore, Peter was temporarily imprisoned and placed under the guard of 4 squads of 4 soldiers each, who alternated in shifts of 3 hours each night. And I remember, I've told you this before, about one time reading in the book of Revelation in Bible class when I was in college. And I got to the word Nicolaitans, and I said Nickelodeons instead. And I don't know what I said on the Quartillians there. I still don't know what I said. But it was 4 groups of 4 soldiers is what we're talking about. And these took different hours to guard certain prisoners. Now, was this heavy guard a response to an earlier incident, like we read about in chapter 5, verses 19 and following? Well, it cannot be supposed that every person had a ration of 16 guards to the prisoner. It was Agrippa's intention to deliver the apostle to the people for execution following the religious festival, that is the Passover, not Easter, as the King James Version says. That is a mistranslation of that word. It is not Easter. It is Passover. And Peter was kept. That is, he was guarded constantly until a more fitting time. In the meantime, the church, sensing the crisis of this situation, kept on praying earnestly for the imprisoned apostle. James had already been taken, and they didn't want to lose Peter also. And so one reflects in passing that there are levels of prayer intensity. As you go back to Luke chapter 22 and verse 44, we somewhat see that. But the brethren, it seems here, had shifted their prayer life into high gear. They were shifted into high gear and praying for Peter here that everything would be okay. Now, we're going to see something interesting later on, of course, as you may already be thinking about, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. But for now, we will stop there, and we'll look more at this particular passage in these 19 verses a little later on.